surfers? This is Rttta, and I am Garrett Williamson, your research guide. This show, Random Things to Talk About, is when I talk about things that interest me, old or new. So today is January 12th, and I'm very sorry that I was not here last week. I was sick, and that's why nothing of mine was even released on the Garrett Studios channel, because I got a cold, and nothing sounded good. My mind wasn't able to go work straight, and so everything was just slow and things, they happen. So yeah, happy ridiculously almost 2 weeks late New Year. So yeah, speaking of the Garrett Studios channel, if you don't know about it for some reason, if you haven't seen notifications that I've already made like a billion times, I have a new channel, which I'm moving all my stuff except for this onto, you know, just because I think I should. I think that it just needs to move on to its own little thing now. So be sure to go check that out if you want to see more of me, because a lot of me will be moving there and leaving here. But new stuff will be happening on here. Chase and I are attempting to try and get more shorts of ours, skits and shorts and other things out as much as possible. We've been planning out some shorts, little shorts to do. So yeah, so I'm sure there was something else I really wanted to say before I got into the main thing, but I really do need to get to the point. So here we go. For all of you that for some reason don't know, even though I've notified you like a whole bunch of times, I am a retro gamer. Here, there's even a Wikipedia page on our tribe of video game players. Internet. Retro gaming, also known as old school gaming, is the hobby of playing and collecting older personal computer, console, and arcade video games. These games are played either on the original hardware, on modern hardware via emulation, or on modern hardware via ports or compilations. I don't know why I just said it that way. I know how to say it. For some reason I just said compilation. Participants in the hobby are sometimes known as retro gamers in the United Kingdom, while the terms classic gamers or old school gamers are more prevalent in the United States. But I'm not British, and yet I call myself a retro gamer. So yeah, there's just the first few sentences of that page. You can just go look up on Wikipedia retro gaming and that'll pop up. So you see, part of the reason I'm such a retro gamer is because so many of my like family and friends and stuff had old game systems and I grew up with them. And I'm talking like old, like I'm talking even back to Atari and the old 8-bit stuff. What I'm going to talk about today is the 16-bit era of gaming, which is the 4th generation of game consoles. We are currently going into the 8th generation of game consoles, so like double that, with game systems, Wii U and Nintendo 3DS and PS Vita paving the way for that. So, I was born around the 32-bit / 64-bit gaming era. Yes, I know, I am that young, but in video game terms, that actually was ancient times back. And also, for those of you who don't know, I have a SEGA Genesis. I know. I don't have an SNES yet. So speaking of which, I decided to talk about both of them. How about this? SEGA Genesis versus the SNES. You'll be here one day, truly in my hands. Will. I promise. So, SEGA Genesis versus the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Which is better? Now, before I get into all the information about, like, the SEGA Genesis versus the SNES and which is better, let me remind you of something. This whole SNES versus the Genesis was totally for real back in the early 90s. The two systems competed for years, and there was never ever a definite leader. This fight between Nintendo and Sega in the 16-bit era was known as the Console Wars, which is still to this day considered marketing-wise one of the fiercest console wars of all time in video game history. So let me give you some information on the two consoles. Let's start with the Sega Genesis. The Genesis was released in 1988 in Japan and in 1989 in America, and 1990 in the PAL regions. It was discontinued worldwide in 97, but completely discontinued in America in 1999. Its best-selling games were Sonic 1, Sonic 2, and Aladdin. Sonic 1 and 2 were pack-ins though, so that might be partially the reason they're so successful. It's just like Wii Sports. That's a really like one of the best-selling games ever, because it was a pack-in with the Wii. The SNES was released in 90 in Japan, 91 in North America, and in 92 in Europe and Australia. It was discontinued in North America in 99, and crazy enough as it is, it was discontinued in Japan in 03. This must have meant that it was very successful in Japan. I mean, it was very successful everywhere, but especially successful in Japan, and they probably just were like, hey, let's keep making them, and then finally in 03 they're like, I think we can stop, because I mean, the GameCube was already out by the time they had discontinued it. And that meaning they hadn't stopped manufacturing the SNES for 13 years. Its best-selling games were Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, and Super Mario Kart. Super Mario World and Donkey Kong Country were both pack-ins as well, so again, that might be partially the reason they were so ridiculously successful. So, like I said earlier, you probably are wondering, now Garrett, which one is better? My opinionated answer is very long, and remember, it's my opinion. So here we go. I'll try to make it brief. Let's get into the cool facts. But let me first say this. The presentation of both consoles was very different. The SEGA Genesis was presented with a much more cool and sexy feel to it. They presented their console and games like much cooler than the SNES and anything Nintendo has done, with cooler games and stuff that's honestly more directed to an older audience, much like the way they're presenting the PS3 and the Xbox 360 compared to the Wii. I mean, even Sonic the Hedgehog was this way. As cute of a character as he was presented with a much more cooler attitude than Mario, and hey, I'm the cooler guy, you should play me because you'll be a much cooler kid if you play my game. You know, obviously Mario has always been presented with a much more cutesy character. And also, the Genesis didn't have any policy for censorship for their games. So any game that had any sorts of blood, gore, anything that shouldn't be seen by an 8-year-old kid, they didn't have a policy for censoring it all out. They just let it on the system. This is a lot of the reason they began game ratings for games. But that's another story for some time later. And then the NES. The NES was obviously presented with a much more kid-friendly type of presentation. And I mean, that's how Nintendo has always been. I mean, they've always been more of like the family-friendly type of presentation of their game consoles type of thing. I mean, the Wii U is sort of competing with its more violent games that they're adding in. But Nintendo, nevertheless, has always been much more, like, kid-friendly overall. Later in the years of SNES, they released more intense games on it just to compete with Genesis because, you know, a lot of people were more attracted to that type of stuff, and the SNES needed to make sure they were competing with it. They did have a policy on their censorship. They did make sure, you know, any game that had a lot of blood and gore in it, it had to be cut way down. They really truly did have a pretty hard policy on censoring their games. This policy was valid to a certain point until ratings came in, and then Genesis sort of took the lead there, and SNES needed to catch up, so they just added ratings to their games and decided to get rid of that policy. But again, that's another story for later. And like I said with Sonic and Mario, Mario was presented with a much more kid-friendly feel as well. And to this day, that's still how it is with Mario and Sonic. Sonic is still presented with a much cooler feel, and Mario is presented with a much more kid-friendly feel. They're both kid-friendly, but Sonic is just presented with a cooler type of, hey, I'm this awesome, cool dude. So now let's get technical. I'll begin with the SEGA Genesis. The processor in the Genesis is a 16/32-bit Motorola 68000. The video display processor is a Yamaha YM7101. The system's display palette in all has 512 colors to choose from, with 64 colors available to show on screen, 183 in shadow/highlight mode. The maximum amount of sprites on screen is 64 or 80, depending on the display. The sound is powered by an 8-bit sound chip called the Yamaha YM2612. Let me give a bit more interesting facts about the Genesis. There have been a variety of models for this SEGA Genesis, as well as the SNES, but I'm talking about the Genesis right now. There was the first model, and then there was the second one, which I have. This is the second model, which was first released in '93. At least audio-wise, the first model is most certainly preferred. The second model's mixing circuit for some reason produced a more distorted sound rather than the first one, which had a much more clean and clear sound. I have no idea why the mixing circuit in the second model sounds so much worse than the first one. It doesn't make sense why that would happen, but things happen and stuff and junk. Now let me head over to the technical specifications of the SNES. The processor in the SNES is a 16-bit Rttta, I think that's how you say it, 5A22, which is a custom-made Nintendo processor. The system's display palette in all has 32,768 colors to choose from. The maximum amount of sprites on screen are 32 and 34 8x8 sprite tiles. The sound is powered by an 8-bit sound chip called the Sony SPC 700. Visually, it also has different modes created by a specific number of background layers and palette sizes. There are 7 different modes. One of the most popular is Mode 7, which gives the game a 3D perspective type of feel. This Mode 7 was used in games such as F-Zero and Super Mario Kart. So, technically speaking, it seems like SNES is the better system. It has very obviously many more colors to choose from than the Genesis, where the Genesis only has 512 possible colors. The SNES has 32,768 colors. But remember, I said better system, not better games for the system. In fact, lots of the time, the Genesis had much more colorful and beautiful graphics in their games because it's a lot more about how you use what you have than how much you have of it. Remember that, very important in life. The SNES also has 7 different modes, you know, with Mode 7 being one of those. The Genesis didn't have that. Of course, they were able to manage to make games that sort of had that effect, but in general, they really did not have a true Mode 7. One thing I noticed, though, at least from what I read, is that the Genesis is able to have more sprites on the screen than the SNES can. The Genesis can have up to 80, the SNES can only have up to 34. The sound on the SNES, technically speaking, is also much better. I mean, just listen to it. The sounds in the system sound far more real and not as synthy sounding as the Genesis. They, of course, don't sound real at all, but you can tell the difference. But get this. I still like the Genesis' sound better. Why? Why would you like something that's lower quality? Well, because personally, I enjoy the harder, bigger, and synthier sound. That's what the Genesis gave me. The SNES gave me a much more real sounding sound-ish, and honestly, much softer. I personally enjoy the harder and stronger groove, and SNES didn't give me that. In fact, somebody did an experiment with Super Metroid by putting its sound into like a SEGA Genesis sound chip. I'm not exactly sure how he did that. I don't know how that happened. And you can hear how the game would have sounded if they had stuck it into Genesis. And I personally liked it better. It honestly sounded creepier, and it was bigger and heavier and harder, and that's exactly what Super Metroid needed, and that's exactly what I enjoyed hearing. Of course, the original soundtrack on the SNES as it's originally heard is still legendary. So, which is better? You want my honest opinion? Really, my honest opinion. Okay, here we go. I don't have one. Seriously, I'm not trying to be fair. I seriously enjoy both of them. They're both truly heaven to me. I think the SNES has some better games like Mario and Zelda and Metroid, but then there's Sonic the Hedgehog and all those games on the Genesis, and boy is that amazing too. And then some ports that were on the SNES I think are better on the Genesis, and vice versa. But then I like the Genesis's music better too. You see, this war was almost ridiculous. They were both... The two of those companies should have just shaken hands and made stuff together, and it would have been heaven on earth. I promise you. And by the way, I'm totally biased, so I'm about to just tell you this to your face. If you're supposedly a gamer, but don't love, like, or have any interest in the SEGA Genesis or the SNES, you're not a real gamer. Not in any way. Sorry. My biased opinion. Honestly, that's almost a fact, but I can't say it's a fact because it's still my biased opinion. So there you go. There's all of that. Hopefully I did that really fast. I talked really fast. I'm still talking really fast, and I'm talking fast. So, question of the week. So yeah, the question of this week, very obvious. I think you would just guess this would come. But which do you think is better, the SEGA Genesis or the SNES? And if you haven't played either game consoles, you need to actually play both to be able to make a comparison and make your favorite. But if you haven't played either, I wouldn't exactly think about commenting, and if you've only played one, I wouldn't think about commenting either. So just make a comment on something else if you haven't played both of them. But yeah, there's the question of this week. So yeah, remember, check out my Garrett Studios channel and the GCWaves 2 channel, the second channel, which is the vlogs and bonus material. So yeah, what should you do to this video? Share it, comment, smash the like button, and most importantly, to me at least, subscribe. Okay, you get the idea. You probably know what that song is. If you don't, then you're a loser! No offense. So yeah, this has been Rttta, and I leave you with one word.